So hello everybody. I'd like to welcome everyone to our International Socialist Conference, the revolutionary alternative to capitalism's climate disaster, organized and hosted by the International Socialist Tendency. And welcome to this meeting on Marxism, class and ecology. My name is Tuna Emran. I'm going to be chairing this session. I'm a member of the Revolutionary Socialist Workers' Party in Turkey. So in this session, we would like to discuss the core theoretical contribution of Marxism to understanding and fighting ecological destruction. We are pleased to have three fantastic speakers at this meeting. Martin Empson from Britain is going to be our first speaker, followed by our second speakers, Sabina Fernandez from Brazil, and then Arima Dal from Australia, who's going to be our last speaker. I'll introduce them just before they speak. By the way, the total time allotted to each speaker is 10 minutes. So once again, another COP process has been a failure. And now we are here while everything converging in a single crisis. We will be discussing the socialist answer to environmental disaster and revolutionary politics to challenge the capitalist system. Without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Martin Empson. Martin will cover the basic core of Marxism's ecological contribution. He's a member of the SWP in Britain. He's the author of two great books, London Labour and The Great Climate Cop-Out. Now I'm going to ask Martin to start off the meeting, please. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Tuna, and thank you, comrades. It's great to be here with so many international revolutionaries who are part of the fight against capitalism's disaster. And I want to start with COP26 because, to me, it is clear that despite many activists having few illusions that COP26 would bring climate justice or bring any significant action on climate change, I think for many people that COP26 has been a disaster on an unprecedented scale. People are utterly shocked at how the big countries, the most powerful economies, have undermined significant action and left the fossil fuel companies to carry on doing what they want to do. And this, we know, will mean disaster for literally millions of people. Let's look at the case of Madagascar. In Madagascar this year, there has been a drought driven by climate change, driven and caused by global warming, which is leaving up to 3 million people short of food, creating millions upon millions of refugees, many people unable to feed themselves or to help themselves. These are the sort of people that have been left to die by the politicians at COP26 in Glasgow. And I think as socialists, we have had little illusion in the COP26 process. We know that for 25 years, COP has been a failure. It's failed to reduce emissions, it's failed to hold back the fossil fuel corporations. And in fact, at that time, we've seen emissions rise. And I think it's important for us to try and understand why that is, because it's not just simply about politicians who don't care, though it is clear that some politicians at COP don't care, or the ones who didn't turn up. They have little interest in solving this problem. They're more interested in facilitating the big corporations and the fossil fuel companies. But it's not enough to place the blame on individual politicians. I think we have to look at the structural problems, the structural issues with the COP process and how they arise out of the capitalist system to understand what is going on. And here I think it's very important and useful for us to return to the work of Karl Marx, because despite it being neglected by many Marxists, what Karl Marx's understanding and explanation of how capitalism works is very useful for us to understand why it is that capitalism has such a negative relationship to the wider environment. You see, Marx begins his explanation of how society is by a very simple fact. He says, how is it that all ordinary people, whatever type of society they live in, whether they live in a feudal society with lords and peasants, whether they live in a small communities of hunter-gatherers, or whether they live in a big global capitalist system, how do they obtain the basic necessities of life? The food they need to eat, the water, the shelter, and so on. And what Marx argues is that humans have always had to labor upon the natural world to change it. For Marx, human labor is absolutely central to his understanding of society. And Marx says that the way that human labor is organized, the way each different mode of production, each society organizes its relationship to nature, determines wider interaction between nature and human society. Marx used the German word Stoffwechsel, which translates perhaps best to the word metabolism in English, to explain how there's a dialectical ongoing exchange of information, of matter, of energy between human society and the natural world as we relate to nature to fulfill those needs. And what Marx says is that's the ongoing thing, that's the constant through human history. Humans labor upon nature to change it, to fulfill and satisfy their needs. But Marx also says you have to look at the concrete specifics in each different society, each different moment in history to understand exactly what's going on. And this led him to talk about how capitalism is a break from the past. In terms of the relationship that we have with nature, it isn't a mutually beneficial one. It isn't one where humans leave nature in a sustainable way. Actually, it's a broken one, a way that is a relationship that is distorted and damaged. Marx comes to understand this through his engagement with the scientific literature of the time, and in particular in his work Capital. He analyzes how capitalist agriculture has moved from a way of organizing the production of food to satisfy human need and transformed it into a way to make a profit. And in doing so, it disrupts all the historical cyclical relationships between humans and nature. Food is no longer grown locally to satisfy human need locally, but instead it's taken away to the cities to be sold for a profit. And this leads to systematic degradation of the environment and the pollution of waters and air. And Marx also argued that as capitalism develops, it transforms humans' relationship to nature. There's a wonderful passage in his work, The Grundrisse, which I haven't got time to quote, but he talks about how nature becomes a commodity, becomes embedded into the capitalist economy as an object for helping maximize profit and the production process. Our relationship to nature under capitalism becomes transformed into an economic one. And we are ourselves alienated from nature under capitalism. Our roots to connections to the land, to the natural world are distorted and broken and shattered as we are alienated. And so thus the capitalists themselves relate to nature in a very, very peculiar way. They see it as part of that economic process. It's a commodity that can be bought and sold and degraded, as I said, as part of the production process. Marx adds into this another factor. He points out that capitalist production is organized to maximize profit. The competing capital, blocks of capital at the heart of capitalism, different companies and multinationals and corporations and firms and so on, are all desperate to make sure that they stay ahead of the game and maximize their profit. And this leads to the competing capitalists to attempt to constantly accumulate their wealth for the sake of accumulation, to make profit for the sake of profit. So they don't care what happens to the environment in the long term. They're not interested in what that means. They're just interested in maximizing their profit. And so when it comes to meetings like COP, that's the framework that the politicians are trying to organize in. That's the framework that they're trying to use. And so what they do is, rather than trying to curtail or hold back or even stop the fossil fuel corporations or other environmental destruction from corporations, they actually try to find ways within that system of solving the problem, which is why they rely on why you hear so much about new technology or carbon trading, emissions trading schemes and so on in the conference halls, because what they're trying to do is to square a circle, to solve an impossible problem, to make capitalism sustainable, when actually its very nature is unsustainable. It's a nature that systematically degrades and destroys the environment. Now, Marx's understanding of why the environment is destroyed by capitalism is rich and runs through actually many of his works, and has been rescued in recent years by Marxists like John Bellamy Foster and so on. But Marx didn't just leave it there. He didn't just start talk about why capitalism destroyed. Marx actually took this analysis and projected it forward and said, actually, if we can solve these problems, if we can transform our relationship to nature once again, we can actually build a society that is sustainable, where we heal the metabolic rift, the separation, and solve that separation between human society and nature. Now, Marx didn't think you could green nature, as I said, but he did understand that it was possible to rationally organize and regulate our relationship to nature. And he talked about that would come about through the creation of a society where ordinary people planned and organized that relationship with nature. There's a lovely quote where he says that the future is the associated producers rationally regulating their interchange with nature. And Marx argued that would arise out of the struggles of ordinary people, out of the working class, who for Marx were the agent of change, the people who had the power to stop capitalism, because they helped make all the profits under capitalism, but they also, through their own revolutionary actions, create the institutions that would make society anew, to create the institutions in society that could run the economy in the interests of ordinary people and the interests of the planet. And I think that the failure at COP26 means that these arguments are no longer abstract. We know that millions of people are calling for system change, but often don't concretely know what they mean. And I think revolutionary Marxists can use these ideas to point to the alternative way of organizing a society. And I think we need to constantly offer Marx's vision and offer that vision as a contrast to capitalist destruction. We need to pose workers' power as the alternative to capitalist destruction. And when people say system change, socialists need to be systematically saying that it is the working class who have the organization and the power both to stop capitalist destruction and to build a new world. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that outstanding speech, Martin. So the second speaker we got today, I'm very pleased to welcome Sabina Fernandez. Sabina is a sociologist and eco-socialist, socialist activist from Basel. She is part of the Global Eco-Socialist Network, and she produces the Marxist digital project called Tezi 11. Is it right? Okay.
Yeah, that's correct. Thank you, Tuna.
She will be speaking about ecological imperialism and challenges of transition in the global south from an eco-socialist perspective. Thank you, Sabina. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thanks to everyone who's participating today. I actually just arrived from Glasgow yesterday from these terrible 2 weeks during COP26. Where most of the point was trying to denounce what was happening inside that in terms of the green capitalist initiatives and things that the UK presidency of the COP is trying to spin as a huge success, but it's only a huge success from the standpoint of the corporations that have been involved in this process for a really long time, and those who promote false solutions to actually tackling climate change, because we know that if it is about tackling climate change, a lot of these businesses would basically have to disappear. So we need to get to the root of the problem. A lot of the things that were spoken about in the past 2 weeks had to do with this divide between the global north and the global south. Within the parameter of the COP26, that means discussions over climate financing, that means discussions in relation to the responsibility for climate change itself and how we're actually going to provide reparations for those that are not that responsible, but are going to bear most of the impacts. So there's this whole situation connected, for example, the least developing countries, they are trying to get more funds, but also countries from the global north that have been promising funds for a really long time, trying to make sure that, yes, we'll provide climate finance, but mostly in the sense of these loans that actually contribute to a long-standing problem of this divide between global north and global south, which is the issue of debt. So a lot of the countries in the global south have been indebted to other countries and to big institutions. So we're talking, for example, about the International Monetary Fund here. And now with the problem of this climate disaster, it might be another situation where countries continue to be in debt and then won't be able to actually fight for the improvement of the lives in these places. But this is not the only situation that we're dealing here. We're also dealing with the matter that the discussions around transition are not actually part of how these negotiations work about. So you probably noticed throughout the past 2 weeks, a lot of announcements that were not quite connected to the negotiations themselves, but because some countries got together and they announced that they would phase out this, or if they would agree on something else, and these made that headlines. And we actually have no way of going and overseeing these extra commitments that were made, and they can just be something to greenwash their image, and then we won't know what's going to come from that. And then the transitions or the discussions around transition come out of these initiatives from each government or perhaps a region. So it's how people have been talking about Green New Deals for a really long time right now. And this presents quite a challenge, because when you look into projects that are very much connected to like domestic planning, that yes, we will change the energy matrix in one particular country from fossil fuel based to renewables, and then you run into another problem, which it is that if you're going to be changing this matrix, that means that you're also changing the way that the extractive industries work right now, right? So it's not just about taking oil and coal from somewhere. And this puts us in a very complicated situation that connects the past of colonialism that's completely connected to the development of capitalism to a new era of what we could even call neocolonialism, in a sense, that has to do with the extractive resources coming out from the global south to make sure that global north can transition, can go into clean energy, that can really develop in that sense. But what does that mean for the economies in these places and for the destruction of nature in these places? Quite a simple example here is we've talked a lot about lithium, and lithium is quite key to these discussions around energy transition, but it's not the only mineral. The World Bank actually released a report last year talking about like an increase in about 500% in demand for lithium, for cobalt, for manganese, for many other minerals. And this is something to consider, because it means that we're talking about Latin America, we're talking about the African country, areas in the Pacific, Southeast Asia. So all of these areas where mining companies, corporate, they are coming from other places, they go there, they mine, and they also pressure the local governments to have fewer regulations. And this presents a challenge in relation both to the exploitation of human labor and the exploitation of nature. And here, when we're talking about Marxism, is where we get to, like Martin already mentioned, about metabolism, and we talk about metabolic rift, but this also connects to something that's called unequal ecological exchange. So these materials that are being taken from one place and to another, and they're causing a metabolic rift in a sorts, because they're being driven somewhere else, and what is sent back sometimes has nothing to do with that, or it could be, for example, garbage, right? So there's a tendency of the flow of commodities, that a lot of these raw materials are going to be sent from the global south into the global north. They go through a process of industrialization, and afterwards what you have is a lot of products that feed into this frenzy of consumerism, and whatever is left over from that, all of that waste that is generated is shipped somewhere else for another country in the global south with fewer regulations to deal with. This is part of the scenario, but this is also connected to, so it's not just an equal ecological exchange, but it's also an equal economic exchange. It's also about this overexploitation of labor in the global south, how these jobs are much cheaper and these lives are easily discarded. So when you look into why do mining companies prefer to mine in certain countries, it's not just because of the availability of the minerals there, but it's also what happens that you can extract them quite cheaply because of such cheap labor. And if something does happen to the workers because of really terrible conditions, well, this is something to be left aside in the developing, underdeveloped world this is not something that's going to grab these many headlines. And this takes advantage as well of this very ongoing process for a really long time of capitalist dependence. So countries in the global south that have not properly industrialized, so they are like constantly exporting a lot of these commodities, and then they are required to import the goods that are produced from these commodities later on at a much higher cost. When we considered currency devaluation, this makes things even more complicated. So it creates a pattern, and a lot of these economies are very much dependent in that sense. So Brazil is a country that we consider to be around dependent capitalism, so like that's where I come from, but other places in Latin America as well. And that creates a huge challenge, because we know then progressive governments in the left, in the moderate left, they will come along and they will not challenge these patterns, because it's understood that this contributes to the GDP, this contributes to economic growth. So we have to keep going in that sense. That's why when we're talking about transition, becomes quite complicated, because there's a whole discussion now around this like green extractivism and these minerals that are quite important for us to make sure that countries meet their NDCs, they meet their targets, what they're promising in terms of the energy matrix, at least. And this for us is quite important to challenge, because what is being established right now is a way of making sure that the current way of producing things in the North continues to be exactly the way it was before, and feeding into this frenzy of like too many cheap products in the market. And we know that it creates this illusion around a type of living that's like much higher standards, yes, than in many other places in the global South, but this type of living is not necessarily as accessible to the working class in the global North either. So the exclusion is maintained in this process, and then the demand for energy is still very high. You take it from somewhere else, and this divide keeps going. And then a lot of what it's talked about is that, well, then it means that in the global South, we're talking about loss and damages, we're talking about adaptation, mitigation, but mostly dealing with the fact that there's no actual coordination, internationalist coordination for making sure it makes sense. And then more powerful countries, governments that are like at the head of the capitalist system, they're trying to make sure that they still get access to these raw materials in the global South, to make sure that their countries get to transition first, and then we'll see whatever is left over. So this feeds back into this process of ecological imperialism that has been going on for a really long time, but tends to get this like new green face in this process when we're talking about the false solution to climate change. Thank you.
Thank you for coming and speaking, Sabrina. Your presentation was amazing and very informative as well. We have more than 300 people who are participating in this meeting now, which is great. After the panel discussion, there's gonna be time for discussion from the floor. So if you would like to contribute or ask questions, please raise your virtual hands while the discussion is going on. So you can be called for our last speaker, Arima. You will have about 2 minutes before the speakers come back and sum up. So now I want to introduce our last speaker, Arima Dal. Arima is a founding member of Workers for Climate Action. She's an activist in the Maritime Union of Australia and a member of Solidarity. She will speak about the central question of the working class and how we can organize workers and the environmental movement together using our experiences working in the maritime industry. So thank you, Arima.
Thank you so much, Tuna and Martin and Sabrina, for your great contributions. I'm zooming in today from Gadigal Aboriginal land in Sydney, and yeah, as a wharfie, a dock worker, it's nice to be doing a night shift for revolutionary politics for a change. So I'm going to talk about the central theme of class and class-based solutions. I think climate change especially exposes that the big decisions that shape our world are made by a tiny minority of people, whether, you know, the decision to open a new coal mine or a solar farm, whether our public transport is electric, or whether our groceries come encased in plastic. It's a popular idea, but a wrong idea, I think, that it's all of us together who cause emissions through what we consume. In fact, just 100 companies globally are responsible for around 70% of emissions. But ordinary working people have no democratic way of planning production according to the principles of sustainability and human need. Instead, most of us have to work for a living for capitalists, for the companies and institutions that make these decisions on the basis of profit, not for people's needs. But that also means that these companies rely on us, on working people, and that's what gives us such incredible power. Australia has a really unique history of working class struggle for the environment. In the 1970s, the Builders and Labourers Federation, a union of brickies and low-skilled construction workers, put bans on building high-rise office blocks, car parks and highways in order to save bushland, parks and low-income housing. The bans were often called for by the community and then hotly debated inside union meetings and enforced with picket lines and even barricades. This episode became known as the Green Bans. 42 projects were stopped in just 3 years and, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars of development. It was an example of the power that working people have to hit back at the system and take control over production. And it gives us a clue of how we can stop new gas and oil pipelines, coal mines or power stations being opened now. And, you know, there's 100 new fossil fuel projects in the pipeline in Australia currently that, if they go ahead, will burn equivalent of 5% of global emissions. But to win this kind of action again, the climate movement must be absolutely on the side of the working class. And I think the question of a just transition is central. We can't leave anyone behind. We have to fight for well-paid union jobs that can replace those that will be lost, and retraining for the people who we need to transfer to those jobs. Like, it's not good enough just to create more jobs. There has to be, you know, transition plans. Going into the big student strikes in September 2019, Solidarity launched a group, Workers for Climate Action, of rank and file trade unionists to push for this class perspective within the climate movement. And climate change is a class question. Just like with the global pandemic, it will undoubtedly be working class people and our communities hit hardest by this climate crisis. I'm a wharfie. I might not look like your typical wharfie, but I work at Port Botany in Sydney unloading container vessels. And like many, many other workers, maritime workers have also been at the forefront of the climate crisis. In the unprecedented bushfire season we had in Australia in the summer 2 years ago, it was MUA vessels that actually helped deliver supplies and rescue families off the beaches of southern New South Wales. One of my workmates lost his house in the fire, and toxic smoke poured from the fires into the cities. At Port Botany, over 100 wharfies at DP World refused to go out and work in the smoke, and then the wharfies at the 2 other terminals followed their lead. And 2 of the companies threatened that the workers were taking what they call illegal industrial action and to stand us down if we didn't go out. So the right to strike to protect ourselves is also central. And in Australia, we have some of the most draconian anti-strike laws, and this threat of illegal action and the use of fines against the most militant unions is commonplace, and unfortunately can be quite effective in stopping this strike action. I think because climate change will produce new workplace health and safety risks that we haven't even thought about yet. Like, we didn't even think about the impact of smoke in relation to the fires until it happened. We won't always have existing agreements to fall back on. It was the Maritime Union, with the help of safety delegates, that did a huge amount of its own research into air pollution, how it's measured, you know, what apps we could use for reliable readings, what kind of work could be done at what levels of of pollution in the air. Like all this was built, from the ground up, and then it had to be enforced on the job. It's not going to be bosses or governments that are looking out for our safety as climate change becomes more unpredictable and dangerous. Already 1 billion workers worldwide are estimated to be exposed to episodes of high heat at work. In terms of the transition itself, my union, the Maritime Union, is one of the ones in Australia trying to get in front of the question of climate change and not just let its members be victims of any transition. We had MUA reps speaking at rallies all around the country during the student strikes in 2019. And at my workplace, we actually stopped work and went out on strike that day and joined the rally. We were one of just 2 workplaces in the country to do so. And again, we got a letter from our employer threatening that we were taking illegal industrial action, but we did it anyway. And, there was no fines in the end. Up to 60% of MUA members potentially could be affected by shutting down fossil fuels. There are workers on, oil and gas rigs, coal terminals, and so on. But instead of dodging this question, the union is fighting for an offshore wind industry. Offshore wind could be a major part of a new energy system. It can provide baseload power, can provide work for hundreds of unemployed seafarers, which we have in Australia, and it can be built off the coast of the very towns that are currently relying on coal jobs. There's a very clear battle in Australia, and I think globally, between left and right over whether it's climate change or climate action that poses the bigger threat to working class people. And the right want to make us think that it's climate action that's threatening people's jobs. The Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, who is infamous for bringing a piece of coal into Parliament, launched what he called the gas-fired recovery coming out of lockdown. He's even committed to building a publicly funded $600 million gas-fired power station in one of the coal-dependent communities. And this is coming from a right-wing government that's wholly committed to privatization and free market politics. But unfortunately, the Labor opposition, has a history of advocating unpopular market mechanisms as solution to climate change. And because of its failure in the last election, is now sort of trying to hedge its bet both ways. But instead, coming out of this pandemic, they should be calling to tax the rich and fund publicly owned renewable energy. And in the climate movement, we've made a just transition and 100% public renewables by 2030 central demands of the movement, because we're not for leaving the climate or the fate of working people up to the market. This demand is strongly supported by the Electrical Trades Union, which has also been fighting with us for climate action and for renationalising the electricity grid so that we can properly plan an alternative. And the ETU have even raised the possibility of putting a green ban on its members working on a huge gas pipeline Santos wants to build across New South Wales, which would destroy Aboriginal lands and is being fought by the local Gamilaroi people. This is the kind of approach that we need that can unite workers in strike with students and deliver system change. We have a chant in the movement in Australia that I'll end on. It's climate action, workers' rights, one struggle, one fight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arima. We are grateful for the time and effort you took to share your thoughts and experiences. So now at the end of this session, we will call our speakers from the floor. You will have 2 minutes for your contributions. Thank you for your questions and contributions. I'm gonna bring in our speakers now who will respond those massive questions. So now I'm bringing Sabina first for a quick sum up, 3 to 4 minutes. Sabina, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi. Sorry, I couldn't unmute earlier. These were all very interesting contributions. I took a lot of notes here, and I think I'm just going to make some quick points. On the role of Indigenous peoples, yes, this is quite important, especially because like we are talking about peoples that have been directly affected by the colonial process and the capitalist process for a really long time, but also excluded from a lot of the leftist spaces, right? When a lot of the leftist spaces were focused on building class consciousness within the industrial working class and forgetting about these communities, like indigenous and traditional communities that have been affected in other ways and that play a different role in regards to nature. So it's important to see this protagonism growing, but it's important to be aware that big corporations and these climate financing schemes and even the UNFCCC, they are also considering how important indigenous voices are to this. So there is a tendency to say that yes, we are included indigenous voices, but it might be just symbolic rather than taking into account what is actually necessary to make sure that indigenous communities are heard and protected and taken seriously. And one major example of this is that yes, they do consider indigenous voices, but conversations around property rights and they continue to be permeated by capitalism, right? So it is not a priority at all of those discussions from the Secretariat of the UNFCCC to talk about territorial rights for the indigenous communities. It's like how we're going to compensate them, and yes, it's really important because they're guardians of nature and things like that. But when it comes to agrarian reform, when it comes to territorial rights, they're usually very silent on this, and this shows that these processes from above, they cannot be trusted to actually move forward with what's needed radically to make sure that indigenous peoples are at the forefront fighting against these different types of colonialism still happening. Something else that I thought was important to mention, yes, a lot of the problems with conversations around transition is that yes, there are jobs that are considered to be greener and they are available, but there are worse jobs. They don't pay as well. They're within the private sector, for example, so they don't offer this much type of security that's necessary. So these, yes, can be like quite frustrating. A lot of the discussions that we need to have around just transition is making sure that we actually take this seriously in terms of the just part of it. So having the public sector at the forefront, leading all discussions around transition, this is quite important. This means that, for example, when we're talking about the oil workers in Brazil, is fighting against the privatization of the national oil company. Because if the company is completely privatized, then it's going to be much harder to transition those workers into a different type of job. And also understanding that it's not a job for us from the outside to go and just say, well, you're going to go through this training for reskilling. It's about the workers themselves identifying what kind of skills they need to acquire and what kind of directions they want to go through. So this obviously means that the role of labor unions is really important here. We need to make sure that we're emphasizing that the labor unions are key, and not just about like climate jobs and things like that, but also mobilizing class consciousness in general to understand that the climate crisis is a crisis completely related to class issues, to race, to gender, to sexuality, to disability. And we need to understand these differences within the movement. So justice is not just part of this chant that we do every time when we're marching from point A to point B asking for climate justice, right? Is when we are building something together from the subjects that are being directly affected.
Thank you, Sabrina. And now I'm going to give the floor to Arima for a sum up. After Arima, I'll be making an announcement about what's coming up. Thank you, Arima.
Thanks everyone for the fantastic discussion. Yeah, I think just following on from Sabrina there, you know, we've brought this demand, this kind of headline of climate justice into the movement, and we are fighting for justice. And even when we're talking about climate jobs, I think we need to, you know, expand our horizons. It's also fighting, you know, for more health workers in hospitals, more better quality public transport, you know, houses for the homeless, more teachers so we can have smaller class sizes. Like we're fighting, we need to fight for a world that's, you know, inspiring, that brings working class people and you know, women, Indigenous people, people of color, like along with us, and that, you know, we're you know, inspiring a future that we want to go forwards into, especially, you know, coming out of this pandemic. Sabrina's absolutely right as well. You know, in Australia, we do have an issue on the existing solar farms, for example, where there's hyper exploitation. A lot of backpackers, migrants are employed there on, you know, very bad conditions, visas that are, you know, held by the employer, where they can be sent back if they lose their job, far away from cities and hard for unions to organize. And those aren't jobs that you can, you know, turn around to people in the mining sector, one of the most well unionized, well paid jobs, and say this is the alternative. So we have to make the just transition very, very real. On the question of Indigenous justice that John Molyneux raised, you know, we say in a lot of our rallies, you can't have climate justice without First Nations justice. There's a lot of examples of the contributions of First Nations people in Australia, but just right at the moment, Santos is trying to drill 850 wells into the Narrabri in Western New South Wales, and the Gamilaroi people are resisting very strongly on their lands. But it's also the case that, you know, not all Indigenous people live on the land anymore. Like, they are also part of our cities, part of the working class, and they've been able to kind of form networks, a group called Gamilaroi Next Generation, where they, you know, can bring that fight to the cities and work with climate activists, with unions, and we've done a really good job there. And some of the unions now want to send sort of contingents, you know, back to the Narrabri to meet with traditional owners there. And politically, you know, there's so much to learn from, you know, cultures that know that for most of human history we didn't commodify air, water and soil. You know, it sort of punctures the myth of the net zero emissions, I think, because, you know, how can you net zero these ecosystems which are so unique? How can you net zero cultures that will be totally destroyed or, you know, dispossessed? So I think, you know, that politics we need and we use in the climate movement. Coming out of the pandemic, I think we're in a really strong position to argue for this radical overhaul of the system, because people actually saw governments, you know, intervene and reshape and redirect the economy overnight. Some of that was very much not in the interests of working class people, like shutting borders and separating families. But on the other hand, you know, our far-right Liberal government absolutely broke their promise of budget surplus, you know, even took over private hospitals and things like that. So I think people are more open to the idea of this kind of radical action. And I'll just end by saying that, you know, capitalism is global. It concentrates the resistance globally, it concentrates the working class globally. And in the last, you know, decade, I think we've seen, you know, with the Occupy movement, with the student strikes, with the Arab Spring, you know, how connected we are and how these global movements do spread so much faster. So I think we're in, you know, a really, really powerful position here. And thanks so much to the people that put on this conference. Having this conversation between all of us, yeah, you know, I think is building the movement we need to go forward.
Thank you so much, Arima. Before giving the floor to Martin again, I have an announcement to make. We will have a half-hour break after this session. After the break, as you know, we will have the third and the last session of the day, stopping environmental destruction and fighting for system change, with Michelle Roubidou from Canada, John Molyneux from Ireland, Alex Kalinikos from Britain, and it will be chaired by Britt Smith from Ireland. Our last session will start at 5 p.m. GMT, 12 p.m. in New York and Toronto, 2 p.m. for Rio, 8 p.m. in Turkey, and 4 a.m. in Sydney. And finally, I now invite Martin to give the closing speech of this meeting. Thank you so much, Martin.
Thank you, Tuna, and thank you to everyone who contributed and to my fellow speakers. I want to start with where Baba Aya said, a comrade from IS Nigeria, because he's absolutely right to tie together the climate crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, because both of these crises arise out of the way nature is subordinated to capital, subordinated to the interest and the drive to make profit. And either situation, both either climate change or pandemic, could easily lead to the extinction of the human race, or certainly the undermining of the conditions for the existence of the sort of societies that we live in. And they are both the result of capitalism's ecological crisis. But also we have to remember that capitalism can drive extinction and horror and destruction in numerous ways. Let's not forget that, you know, China, Australia, and America are flexing their muscles militarily around spheres of influence. Let's not forget the way that capitalism creates economic crisis and stagnation and horror and homelessness and poverty, and as well as racism, homophobia, transphobia, and so on. And all of these things can be analysed and understood by the framework that Marx left us. Marx, however, didn't just analyse it. His thoughts and ideas are a guide to revolutionary practice, to revolutionary action. They encourage us to think about the world and understand it with a view to change it. And it's good that comrades have talked, I think, a lot about class today, because if you remember those words from the Communist Manifesto, when Marx talks about the grave diggers, that capitalism creates the grave diggers of society, of capitalism, the people who've got the power to change it. And that's interesting. I think the fact that, as comrades have said, those grave diggers, the nature of the workers has changed throughout history, but they all still today play a fundamental key role in the making of profit, and thus have a power to change it. Less than a decade after Marx's death, there was a group of workers in London who were thought to be unorganizable. But they're mass strikes of the dock workers, and it's great to tell the story, sharing a platform with a docker in Australia. The mass strikes of those dockers, often very, very young people on casual contracts, created a whole wave of new trade unionism with hundreds of thousands of people on strikes and new mass trade unions. And I think workers today around the world are rebuilding some of that things, those sectional groups that sometimes can't be organized, lorry drivers, for instance, who have now been shown their enormous power in capitalist society. And I think the pandemic has shown for millions of us the important role of many people who remain hidden under capitalist society: cleaners, distribution workers, lorry drivers, and so on. They have enormous power to change things, and that's absolutely crucial. Now, see, I detect out of COP26 one other thing which I think it's important to raise. I think the ruling class is scared. The ruling class knows that it's going to have a lot of problems to deal with climate change, and they recognize that there's a big movement on the streets that's very, very radical. Amy spoke in the opening session about Obama trying to incorporate movements into the framework of COP26. I heard a brilliant speech by Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, who spoke at COP about how the money was there, and then said, look, this isn't blah, blah, blah. Forced to recognize the comments and criticisms from an 18-year-old climate activist. That's how worried they are, and they haven't got a way of solving that problem, but we have, because we've got a recognition and understanding that working people can change the world, because I don't think capitalism will deliver the transformation. The capitalism will offer us a choice. Rosa Luxemburg, during the First World War, said that the society faced a crossroads, the choice between socialism and barbarism. But the reality is barbarism is already here. Think of those millions of refugees. Think of the flooding. Think of the destruction and the wildfires. That barbarism is already here. Socialism is offering us, the choice facing society today is socialism or extinction. And that's the choice that faces society. It won't be a green capitalism. They cannot do it. That's why COP26 failed. The task of socialists and revolutionaries around the world is to build the sort of movements that can confront capital, can fight for reforms now, like a just transition, like for climate jobs, and use those battles to give confidence to the workers to fight for a socialist future. That's the only way that we will build a sustainable future. And that's the task of socialists in the here and now today. Thank you very much, comrades.
Thank you. Have a good evening.